Right, ready to start? We all good? Right, so those looking at me kind of with a curious eye, I'm not Lindsay Hilsum. She hasn't had a terrible accident and kind of changed into me. I've been drafted in as a last-minute replacement, but hopefully I'll do my best. We've got a very esteemed panel. So, talking about Libya, just when you think it can't get any worse, it gets worse. As of last week, it got a lot worse. As many of you know, ISIS have now very much established their presence very much in Derna and other parts of Libya. There's been airstrikes both from militias inside Libya and from external actors such as Egypt. And the financial situation in Libya is going from worse to worse. And yet still, if you were to walk the streets in Tripoli or many other cities, you wouldn't tell that Libya was heading towards ruin. A friend yesterday sent me pictures, video of celebrations happening in central Tripoli, as if it was 2012. And it begs the question, what exactly are people celebrating? But yet, if you were to go to any city, it would just seem normal. So that's the paradox of Libya, and that's what we're going to explore today. And luckily, we have a very esteemed panel here today to explore it. We're going to start from left to right. So we have Mary Fitzgerald, one of the best Western journalists writing on Tripoli these days, has been based in Tripoli for much of the past 3 years, and is one of the contributors to the book The Libyan Aftermath and Its Revolution, which is on sale here on the right. And then we have
Libyan Revolution and its aftermath.
The Libyan Revolution. What did I say?
You said the Libyan aftermath.
Libyan Aftermath. Kind of makes sense. On my left, I have Alham Saoud, co-founder of Libyan Lawyers for Justice. Alham Saoudi. On my right, Juma Al-Gmati, the former UK envoy for the National Transitional Council. On my right, Peter Cole, former analyst for the International Crisis Group, and also contributed to the book. And sorry, editor of the book. Sorry. And finally, on the right, Abdurrahman Al-Agheli, co-founder of the Libyan Youth Forum. So, shall we start from the left? Mary? So, Mary, you spent much of the past few years in Tripoli on the ground, interviewing major power players in Tripoli. Can you tell us more about what insight that's given you into the current situation?
Well, I was part of the first wave of journalists into eastern Libya in February 2011, arriving in Benghazi on February 25th, about 10 days after the very first protests broke out there. And I went back to Libya several times during the revolution and several times during the transitional period, spending all last year living in Tripoli and traveling throughout the country. And I remember this time last year discussing with a range of Libyan friends about how crucial 2014 was going to prove for Libya. There were several milestones imminent, including the second parliamentary elections. There was a constitutional committee due to be elected to draft Libya's first post-Gaddafi constitution. Several milestones that were very, very important indeed. But none of us, I think, expected that we would see an unraveling that we have seen over the last 6 months in particular. The scale and speed of Libya's unraveling has been really quite extraordinary, and extraordinary to witness. And something that has really struck me is how deeply divided the country is now. I talk about the poison of polarization that has seeped into Libyan society. You're talking about a country that is divided, regions that are divided, communities that are divided, even families that are divided. I know brothers and families who are fighting each other, literally. And that has been really, really saddening to witness. And right now we see Libya at a juncture where not only is it caught in this vicious political power struggle between two governments, one internationally recognized and based in eastern Libya, the other self-declared and based in the capital Tripoli. But we also see the rising specter of ISIS in Libya. We've all seen the events of recent days, the video showing the execution of 21 Egyptian Christians by ISIS, and then of course the Egyptian airstrikes that prompted. So the speed of Libya's crisis, the speed of the unraveling, is really quite extraordinary. And on the ground in Tripoli, and I was there most recently a couple of weeks ago, it's the sense of uncertainty. For sure, we saw yesterday demonstrations celebrating February 17th, but I always speak of Tripoli as abnormal normal. On the surface, life seems okay-ish. People are going out to cafes, they're going out to restaurants, the usual traffic jams of Tripoli. But underneath, there's a deep sense of unease, a deep sense of uncertainty, and a sense of fear as well. Many people have left Tripoli because they simply don't feel safe in Tripoli anymore. Activists, people who are critical of the status quo in Tripoli, they don't feel safe in Tripoli anymore. And equally, we can say the same for Eastern Libya. People who question the status quo in Eastern Libya, question what's happening in Benghazi, don't feel particularly comfortable there as well. And that's why we've seen, displaced 400 people displaced in Libya. We've seen huge numbers of Libyans leaving Libya entirely. There's a whole new generation of Libyan exiles, people who feel for all kinds of reasons that life is not good in Libya right now and life is not safe. So to finish up, I think it's going to be very, very difficult that given that Libya has reached this juncture, given how deep the are, Libya faced all kinds of reconciliation challenges after 2011. And now we're talking about a whole new layer of reconciliation challenges after the events of the last year.
Thank you, Mary. Mary talked about the kind of divisions within Libya, the territorial divisions, and hinted at the ideological differences between people there. How have people who have perhaps been of a different ideological or of the wrong region perhaps, how have they fared under the leadership of a sub-faction or a militia that hasn't agreed with them in terms of human rights?
Yeah, I think we can actually answer that question by tracking back through what happened since 2011 for the voice of the other in Libya, whatever that other might be. In fact, there's three trends to look at in Libya. The first would be revolutionary legitimacy, which has hijacked Libya since day one of the revolution, which is if you're with us, and if you're against us, you either are quiet or you're dead. Unfortunately, we don't even have the luxury of prisons that we see in Egypt. So I think one of the themes I want to really get home here is this idea of Libya that we've replaced, or the revolution has replaced the rule of law. Instead, we have revolutionary legitimacy. So your status in the country is really not defined by whether what you do is legal or illegal, or correct or incorrect, but whether you're on the correct side in that specific area. The other theme I wanted to get on is the sort of rule by law versus rule of law. And that is, the rule of law is this concept we have in the legal profession that, there's an understanding of what human rights is, there's an understanding of what our ethics as humans are, and we live by them. Rule by law is when you use the law to effect whatever rule you want. And what we've seen in Libya is exactly that. So from day one of the revolution, it's been rule by law. We've had law after law after law, that the sole purpose of which is to enshrine political ideology as opposed to open up freedom. I can go on forever, but the key ones are obviously the anti-glorification law, which is one of the opening laws, which not only banned you from speaking positively of Gaddafi, but more crucially, banned you from speaking ill of the February 17th revolution. So an effective gagging order. That was eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but has been recently reinstated, if you like, through Law 5 of 2014, which creates a criminal offense for criticizing the February 17th revolution. You have the amnesty law that we had in the same year as the anti-glorification law, which gave a blanket amnesty for anything done in the name of the revolution, which is the only, by the way, forward-looking amnesty in history. Normally amnesties cover past deeds. Ours gives you a blanket to act as you wish going forward. We have the political isolation law, which disenfranchised entire communities from taking part in the political process because of what they believed or positions they held as opposed to crimes they committed. And then we also have what I call the Mufti law, which is Law 15 of 2012, which banned the criticism of any of the Mufti's statements, or actually, I correct that, it bans the discussion of any of the Mufti statements in the media. So that package of laws is very much what we based our revolution on in terms of laws, and it's where we go from, and it's what we inherited. So all the revolution seems to effectively have done is remove 1969 and put 2011. The rest is status quo in terms of how you're treated if you're the other. And the
Which
final...
one's the political isolation law? Is that?
It's Law 35, 30, I don't know, I'll get it for you.
Yeah.
But that's been recently declared void by what people are referring to in this panel, I guess, the internationally recognized government of Libya. And the third theme I want to get out there is this and it's a serious flaw in the first element, which has got us to where we are, this total impunity for violations of human rights, and it's how we dealt with fighters. When the revolution was over, we did not hold a single fighter liable or responsible for a single violation of human rights that was committed. What we chose to do is integrate them into our official, semi-official forces. And so what victims now saw was that the person who was previously the perpetrator was now the law enforcer. And that's a really tough time if you're a victim. So the fix for the problem was to integrate militias instead of hold them accountable. Those are just 3 themes I thought I'd open with to get us thinking about why we're here and why actually in Libya what we've ended up with is impunity and not accountability.
Very much. Jean-Marc Marty, you were on the ground in 2011 working with the Benghazi and also here working as liaison with the UK government.
No, only here. I've never been to Libya until November 2011.
November, okay. What do you think the NTC could have done differently during that time, and how has that affected the kind of course that it's been taken since then?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Mary and Peter, the contributors and editors of the book, The Libyan Revolution and Its Aftermath. I think it's an excellent book, one of the best written after the Libyan Revolution, and thank them for having me on the panel here. Going back to April, as early as April and May of 2011, when people like the head of the NTC government at that time came here, and also Mustafa Abdul Jalil, the head of NTC, they both came for official visits, and I actually was with them a whole day when we held meetings with Cameron and William, various other European foreign ministers, and also with Hillary Clinton and others. The mood was very, very optimistic, was upbeat. Everybody thought that the Libyans showed remarkable unity in this revolution, and that hopefully very little could go wrong, and that it was inevitable that Libyans would win, obviously with the help of the international community under the intervention of the United Nations and Security Council Resolution 1973. Now, I remember the Foreign and Commonwealth Office kept asking me all the time, Juma, at the moment Gaddafi is uniting all of you. You are all united because Gaddafi. Once Gaddafi disappears, what is going to unite you? And I was very naive to answer, well, look, you know, the vision of a democratic, very prosperous Libya that has the best ingredients to be the most developed country in the region, that we will be the Norway of North Africa, that vision is going to unite us as Libyans. I admit with hindsight, I was very naive. It is not as simple as that. Democratization is not easy in the Middle East and in an Arab country that has never experienced democracy ever, as we know democracy in the modern times. So the reality really hit us after the liberation. It's probably things went wrong from the day Mustafa Abdul Jalil gave that liberation speech. And journalists in the UK kept phoning me that day, all day, and said to me, Juma, is that what your revolution was all about? Polygamy and just marrying 4 wives, the right to marry one? And obviously, Mustafa Abdul Jalil naively delivered the wrong message that day. I think the liberation speech could have been a historical message to give Libyans a new vision, a new purpose, a new reason to unite after they got rid of Gaddafi. But unfortunately, he failed, not with any bad intentions, obviously, and the NTC failed. What went wrong after that? I'll just mention very quickly very few points. First of all, it is true that unlike Tunisia and Egypt, Libya had no institutions whatsoever, had no form of state or state institutions. Gaddafi, over 42 years, ensured that any form of institutionalization has been totally decimated. So what we had after Gaddafi disappeared, we had a total vacuum. Physics tell us vacuum has to be filled with something. And what was it filled with? It was filled with militias, with lots of weapons, probably over 20 million pieces of weapons of different types, including tanks. So those militias, the NTC made a disastrous decision when they said they were going to pay them salaries ranging from 1,000 dinar to 4,000 dinar. All of a sudden, we had a proliferation. From only 20 or 25,000 fighters, they became 250,000 fighters, drawing salaries from the state. Being a typical rentier economy and rentier system, Libyans only live on salaries drawn from the state. So everybody grabbed that opportunity. So that is lack of institutions, vacuum filled by militias, paying militias money. That is one of the, with hindsight, that one is the biggest mistakes the NTC has made. Also, the roadmap that we had was very weak. The constitutional declaration was not really a strong, robust document. Capacity, we admit, 42 years of Gaddafi meant that very little capacity. Capacity is very weak in Libya, partly due to the education system. I researched this thoroughly in my PhD, and I remember in 2010, I looked at the quality of education in Libya over the last 30 years. It was second from bottom in the world, in the whole world. Now it's probably the bottom. So that shows you how weak capacity is in Libya. When you have weak capacity, it's not easy to embark on state building like that. Another point which is very important, I think, is that the UN and the alliance that was forged under the umbrella of the UN, including European and America, did a great job coming to help the Libyan people and protect civilians by airstrikes. However, I think after the liberation, they just walked away. Last night, I was on a Radio 4 program, and Alistair Burt was there. Remember, he was a minister at the Foreign Office at that time. Alistair Burt said, after the liberation of Libya, after the revolution, we offered all sorts of expert and advice and support. I'm sorry, they didn't. They didn't. Yeah, especially the British and the French and the Italian embassies. And I was in contact with them regularly over 2012 and 2013. The only thing they were interested in is to secure contracts for their companies. Capacity was very little. Now, you could say they were right to walk away because they didn't want to be accused or seen as meddling in Libya's affair as the new colonizers or the new occupator. We didn't expect them. We didn't want them to go as far as having troops on the ground, securing Libya totally, and appointing a Karzai or a Brema. But they could have offered a lot more support, capacity building and expert support in how to actually build institutions and how to actually guide this transition safely until it achieves its objective and we achieve what we call the permanent status. So these are just I think these are just few of the points that actually believe went wrong with hindsight and with retrospect about the NTC. Yes, the NTC had a great intentions. It united Libyans during the revolution, but honestly, it offered very weak political leadership. It's partly not their fault because capacity in Libya is very weak. Gaddafi for over 42 years have never allowed any true, genuine, strong political leaders to develop or evolve inside Libya. Those who came from the diaspora, and I'm one of them, were not any better, unfortunately. That's what I will end on. Thank you,
Mr. Muammar. That gives us a very good question for Peter. Do you think it's fair that the analysis that the international community abandoned Libya after UN Resolution 1973? What could they have done differently?
Well, I mean, the process of editing the book was essentially our contributors and our interlocutors were people, Libyans, regional players such as Egypt, Qatar, the UAE, and of course NATO and the West, who were actually engaged in the problems of post-revolutionary Libya. So it became the book process became a process of actually facilitating and carrying out that conversation. The question of whether the international community walked away, I mean, Abdel Fattah Sisi's plea to the UN to to re-engage in Libya has kind of shown us that what we have had is on the one hand, this huge hunger from the region, from Libya and the regional players for more involvement, versus certainly real caution from the international community. And if I can sum up the mood on the more international side, NATO and the UN, I would say that the mood is above all very self-aware. Post-Iraq, the question of what internationals can do in countries like what they should do is a very nuanced one, and people have a certain amount of not exactly cynicism, but realism about what could be achieved. I think above all, and you have to remember as well that the UN resolution that enabled the no-fly zone and the UN support mission that followed was a Libyan-led process. It was done at the behest of the NTC on the condition that there was a legitimate Libyan political partner with which to engage. That is one of the huge limitations it's had. There is still enormous distaste for a military solution in Libya from the international side. I would say, in terms of the Arab countries in the region, they still, on the whole, would probably prefer or have more willingness to back a military solution, but I have not seen any such from the West in that regard. There's also a certain chicken and egg thing, which is that you need to have a political settlement in Libya before international involvement can be legitimate and legitimized. Libya is remaking its country from a very profound level, and as Jum'a said, there are very few legitimate institutions or strong enough institutions. For example, a Ministry of Defense, a Ministry of the Interior, a presidency, a prime ministership. These things which exist in countries like Iraq to a certain extent, exist to a far smaller extent in Libya, which is to do with how Gaddafi ran the country. So you need to have what is the civil war in Libya right now is precisely a political struggle. It's a struggle between Libya's communities and tribes and ethnic minorities over power and governance. And to a certain extent, that question needs to be resolved before a robust military training or something like that, or peacekeeping can be involved. Again, the regional dynamic is very important. The broader war in the region between political Islam Brotherhood and more nationalistic secular forces matters. If there is a coup in Yemen or if there is a struggle in Gaza, this does prevent dialogue on the Libya question. When you get to a more strategic level of NATO and the UN, for example. And also I think there's a healthy recognition that a political progress needs to be matched by progress at the level of civil society, both in terms of empowering women and minorities and this kind of thing, but also making sure that any agreement at the top is able to be backed up. The militias, of course, the payment and the backing of the militias by the central bank and the state is a problem, but also the individual militias themselves are so small and fragmented that it is hard to target them, for example, with sanctions. And finally, I think that above all, we're seeing a desire not to mess up or pervert or distort the institutions that do have a function in the country. And I would highlight two. One is the central bank, which there is a struggle for power over the central bank at the moment because it is the source of salaries that pay the militias. And the second would be the constitutional, the CDA, the Constitutional Assembly, whose work is ongoing. There is obviously desire to see that process go forward speedily, but not too speedily. The last thing you want is an Egypt situation where a constitution is rushed through and then disputed, for example. So getting the CDA right and then getting the support of the social fabric right is key.
Are they still continuing their work, the CDA?
Yes,
are we expecting any drafts?
They are still continuing their work. I can't tell you the exact status of the draft at the moment, but Ali Tahouni is regularly travelling the country and outside. So it is one of the hopes for the Libyan process right now is that Tahouni can come up with a document that pleases everybody, which is a huge challenge for him. I've been very, very swift, but these are, in summary, the kind of conversations that are happening at the international level. It's far short of, military intervention. We may see something like that from the UN peacekeeping, DPKO, but again, I think the mood is somewhat tentative and realistic.
Sure. All right, to bring it to you, Abdurrahman, we've heard a lot about militia. Mr. Gmati was saying that it was one of the primary mistakes of the NTC to fund these militias and therefore entrench them by giving them some kind of legitimacy. But don't you think that it's a case of you can't live with them, you can't live without them in terms of militias? They were the only kind of security forces there on the ground, and so they had to be supported at that period in time. And how do you think we can move from a situation where we have this network, with each one controlling a separate part of the country, and in cases separate parts of cities, to a national unified force?
It's very difficult to talk about Libya-related issues in less than 5 minutes because in Libya, unfortunately, the devil is in the detail. And to summarize certain issues is to gloss over very key nuances. So I'll try my best. The points that the previous speakers made very much relate to the issues that we're having now. And I very much understand exactly where Jean was coming from in his description of the institutions of Gaddafi and the military insecurity. However, the reality is that the vacuum that existed in Libya wasn't necessarily an institutional vacuum. It was a leadership and political vacuum. If we had no institutions, we would have found it much easier. The reality is that Libya was full of institutions, and those institutions were the toxic and destructive effectors of change. The state, before the revolution, the public sector, employed 1.2 million people approximately, over around 26 or 27 different ministries, 360 state-owned companies. Services were nationalized. The security apparatus was extremely deep. It was very much a deep state. During the 90s, at the heyday of the security sector, there was around 100,000 people directly or indirectly working for the intelligence apparatus, internal and external. So what were these people doing? The institutions, many of them were just receiving salaries, but the majority of them were actually counterproductive. So having been involved in national security issues and security sector reform and DDR since mid-2011 with the executive office, the NTC, all the way up to the Zidane government and then the Thani government, I can tell you that the decisions and actions of the state and the lack of a clear vision on DDR and the lack of understanding on the nature of the armed groups directly contributed to the formation and retrenchment of the armed groups as we know them now. To understand the issue of armed groups is not to speak about them necessarily as armed groups, but as an armed population. Up to the liberation of Tripoli in August 2011, there were armed groups. For example, in Tripoli, there was only 4 armed groups outside of the capital who were fighting in various areas of Libya. Once the Battle of Bab al-Aziziyah happened, and the various security apparatus retreated from their barracks and weapons depots, there was a mass armament. There was a rush of local communities, local inhabitants in cosmopolitan areas and other areas to arm themselves. And the Tripoli Military Council and Supreme Security Committee, both of which I was part of, unfortunately, opened the gates to the legitimization of the armament of the population by issuing ID cards, with the Tripoli Council issuing around 10,000 ID cards in Tripoli in the course of around 2 weeks in the office in High Tea Street. So to understand the issue of armament and disarmament I won't be able to speak about it in detail, is to understand the socio-economic conditions that led to the huge numbers of people who feel it's their right and their entitlement to receive a salary from the state, along with the issue of legitimacy that these people feel, and also to recognize the issue of the difference of the nature of armed groups in different areas of Libya. So in places like Tripoli, the armed groups that exist in Tripoli are mainly loosely organized groups of armed individuals. And you might be able to talk about their reintegration, their employment, you might be able to talk about their elimination, because they don't, the armed groups in cosmopolitan areas don't necessarily have a social structure such as a tribe or a regional interest that they represent. But to talk about disarmament in places like Misrata, in the towns of the mountains, in the south and in the east, is to talk about a completely different situation. Armed groups that exist there represent the interests of the community or the area that they come from. And those include the social structures in that area, whether it's a tribe, family, business interest. And it's not a coincidence. The number of armed groups in Misrata is very similar to the number of families in Misrata. So there's around 280 to 300 families, large families, and there's around 250 or so armed groups. And these armed groups are affiliated to families and elders, and they have the support of their areas. Places like Tripoli, that's not necessarily the issue. So you had the issue of the Supreme Security Committee and their efforts, then the Warriors Affairs Commission, and this is what Juma was referring to when it came to the issue of around 250,000 fighters, because they conducted an audit in order to gauge what was the desires of the armed groups, and they came to that figure because 250,000 people turned up and said that they were revolutionaries. In fact, it was just a manifestation of their desire and their entitlement to a salary and a position within the state. So earlier I said that the socio-economic conditions are important. I won't be able to go to it in detail, but basically to understand the issue of disarmament and also solving the crisis is to understand desires and fears. What are the desires of individual Libyan citizens? What are the desires and fears of armed groups and even political actors? They have a desire for socio-economic leading to political empowerment. They have a fear of being marginalized from the socio-economic and political process by their opponent if their opponent wins. So they're stuck in a zero-sum game. And the logical conclusion is that there is no logical reason for, a logical or rational reason for there to be a conflict in Libya at the moment. It's all emotional reasons. And for me, this very much comes down to the link between Gaddafi's creation of a rentier state, the way he defined who are the stakeholders and owners of economic empowerment in Libya, and how he made the citizen feel like he was also a stakeholder, but without actually receiving a tangible piece of that economic and political empowerment. Every Libyan knows that he is entitled to some form of empowerment, but he doesn't know how to get it. There's nothing tangible. And this is what we mean when we say we need a tangible vision. We need a tangible vision for the economic and political empowerment of Libyan citizens, and therefore the creation of state institutions.
Sure. Thank you, Abdurrahman. We're going to start again from the left and see if you have anything that you'd want to respond to from the other speakers, or alternatively, I had a question for you. We've heard several kind of naivety, mass naivety on the part of Libyans, or if you don't want to call it naivety, you could call it the kind of a mismanagement of expectations about what would happen after the revolution vis-a-vis what has actually happened. Do you think people are finally waking up now and thinking, well, this isn't quite how we'd hoped it to be, and it won't be unless we make major changes? Or is there still this kind of delusion, if you like, that we can celebrate the 17th February revolution and it will be fine in the end?
Well, on this particular anniversary, I've been struck by the amount of revisionism happening amongst Libyans in Libya and the Libyan diaspora. People looking back from the distance of 4 years now at 2011, and not only asking the questions of what if in terms of the various twists and turns of the revolution, also questioning some of what happened. And you know, it's important to state that this isn't a kind of nostalgia for the old order and the old regime. It's just a case of looking back and looking at what possibly should have been done differently, as Juma was pointing out earlier. One thing I've been struck by over the last year as well is the sense of disillusionment and disenchantment amongst the general population in Libya, a disillusionment with the transition more generally, and also I think it's fair to say a disillusionment with the democratic process. I was in Libya in July 2012 for the first post-Gaddafi elections, the first elections indeed that Libya had experienced in decades, and it was an extraordinary day. The elections passed off relatively smoothly, and there was a sense that Libya had passed a milestone. The turnout was something like 1.4 million people. This year, during the parliamentary elections in June, the turnout was just over 600,000, which is an extraordinarily dramatic drop. And I was in Libya on election day in June, and I spent half the day in Benghazi and half the day in Tripoli. And in Benghazi, many people were saying to me, you know, this democracy thing, forget it, security comes first. And these were people who were supporting the retired General Khalifa Haftar in his operation against militias in Benghazi. And that was a strong sentiment in Benghazi on election day. In Tripoli, people were telling me that a lot of people were saying, what's the point in voting when real power in Libya is not vested in elected institutions or state institutions? Real power is vested in the militias, the men with the guns. So what's the point in voting? And I found that really worrying, that people were already losing faith in the democratic process. We're already feeling disconnected from it. We're already withdrawing from it. And what you have in many parts of Libya now is basically ordinary citizens trying to get on with life as best they can. So they're making all kinds of alternative measures in terms of overcoming the privations that the conflict of the last 8 months have caused. And people are really under pressure, talking about fuel shortages, power cuts, interminable power cuts, rising food prices. Libyans are under enormous pressure. And there's really a sense that the two rival governments, if you like, are more interested in continuing this power struggle than actually governing in any real sense. And that's causing a lot of resentment on the ground.
It's interesting that you mentioned the stability kind of democracy payoff, because that's a pattern that you can see recurring throughout the Arab world as disaffection with the Arab Spring rises. There was a Pew poll that came out earlier this week, I think, that showed that even last year in Egypt, 60% of the people would support democracy over stability. But now that's completely changed. So it's kind of phenomenon that's gone beyond Libya, really.
And there is a current in eastern Libya now that is pushing for Khalifa Haftar to, not only be commander-in-chief of an army, but also head. They're calling for the establishment of a supreme military council, which would be headed by Haftar. Mm-hmm. There is a current calling for that, and that didn't come out of a vacuum.
Yeah. Okay. Alham, from what we've heard today, and obviously what we've been sensing over the past 2 years. Libya is going to be in for an extended period of fragmentation, of there not being a coherent state. How will transitional justice, how will going after war criminals, how will that happen in this context? How can it happen?
Yeah, I think that's the question. I mean, what's been really depressing for me on this panel is I was the only person who talked about human rights violations, law, accountability, or impunity. We're talking about the most cliched sort of first year at law school question of peace versus justice. And I think that has been settled and put to bed a few decades ago. There is no, this debate of having peace instead of justice, you can't have peace without justice. And I think that's if there's one quote you take from me, please let that be it tonight. But I think for me that's the biggest issue is, we constantly keep feeding into this concept that, now what's important is getting things to cure. And we get, people who in some level were involved in the government on this panel, declaring no responsibility for actions, saying they were naive, saying it was a mistake, they'd made mistakes. And this is exactly the pattern we see repeating over and over in Libya. There's a phenomenal trend in politicians, and it's picking up on what you said, Mary, of total lack of responsibility for actions. We issues to the other again. So then if you're speaking to certain people in Western Libya, it's Haftar's issue. If you speak to certain people in the East, it's the militias in the West's issue. If you speak to normal Libyans, it's Qatar's issue. We don't take responsibility for the situation. And that all started with the fact that we gave utter carte blanche to revolutionaries because they were the heroes to act with impunity. Transitional justice is not about it's not a sort of specific kind of justice that you have to get you from A to B. It's a justice in time of transition. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we're not doing law differently. Crimes aren't redefined. But in Libya, they are. If you look at the way the laws have been defined in Libya, including laws on things as basic as torture, they're not defined by the act. They're defined by the perpetrator. If you did this and you were X, then it's not a crime. It's related to who did what to whom and not what the action was. And I think that's the problem. When people talk about transitional justice in Libya, they're only looking at Gaddafi era and all the laws that have been passed. No one is talking about anything that's happened since February 17, 2011. That is not up for conversation at the moment. And for me, if we want to get genuine security, the people now who are committing violators are the ones that should be up first for accountability and justice, and not things that happened in 69 and 70 and 71. But that's not what we want to say that it's not our fault. We can't say anything about these poor politicians who have no experience of democracy. Because you know what? Most countries that are new to democracy didn't have experience of democracy. And you have to take responsibility for your actions. So I'm sorry, if you put up yourself for a job, you need to do the job.
But on that point about justice, who is going to bring those people to account if they're the ones who are actually holding power now?
There's lots of mechanisms, and I think that's that's the kind of question that's really frustrating. There's lots of different mechanisms that we do have. Yes, we can't have accountability in country at the moment, but the UN has various mechanisms to it that are within its power. We have Resolution 2174, which grants them the ability to asset freeze and put travel bans on a lot of the militias today. We have the ICC, who still has a mandate. We indeed, even within the country, we have a system whereby you can vet those who you pay with government money. That is something you can definitely do. You can, interview people for a job. And I think there is that kind of really basic mechanisms which you can hold people accountable with. It's not always about a courtroom and prison. We appreciate that that's not possible in Libya at the moment. In Libya at the moment, we have over 8,000 people, over 10,000 people in prisons, only 10% of whom have been given any charge. So it's not about that. And I just want to put some numbers in people's minds so they can really picture what's going on in Libya. There's over 10,000 prisoners in Libya. And based on research we've done with with our partners, 53% of those in prison in Libya will be tortured. We're not talking about, people are being held and because it's for security reasons. These people are not just being held, these people are being tortured. 1 in 5 households in Libya have someone who's missing or detained. Put those two numbers together and you can see why it's an emotional issue. And if we've got politicians who wash their hands of it and say, what can we do? We don't have experience.
Yeah.
That's all you're ever going to go up in numbers.
Do you think that's fair, Mr. Gwati? I mean, you mentioned that Libyans went from a situation where there were 0 institutions to a context where they had to build a state based on nothing. Don't you think this left the people who held power and put in positions of authority in a catch-22 situation where they were put in power but didn't have any experience of running? And those that did have experience were part of the old regime.
Let me be very clear and very straight and echo Ilham's always highlighted issue about human rights violations. There are human rights violations in Libya after the revolution, probably much graver and more than what we've witnessed during the last 5 or 10 years of the Gaddafi era. I'll be very clear about that. As somebody who's campaigned for human rights and worked closely with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch over probably 20 or 30 years. However, human rights violations and something else which is also very bad in Libya, and that is endemic systematic corruption. These two things, they say, I'm not an authority on transitology and transitions from dictatorship to democracy, but they say during transitions, those two things increase sharply: corruption and crime and violations of human rights, simply because of the lack of institutions. We need to combat corruption, and we need institutions to safeguard human rights. Institutions like judiciary. We don't have strong judiciary, and Ilham knows about that. She should be an expert on that. We don't have functioning courts. We don't have institutions that monitor these things. Regulatory institutions are almost non-existent or they're ineffective. So it's a chicken and egg. Do we build the institutions first, or do we tackle these serious issues like human rights violations and endemic corruption first? How do we tackle this? It's a paradox. The other thing I would like to
what's the answer to the paradox? It's clear that there is a paradox, but how do you go about getting out of it?
We should concentrate on institution building. At the same time, we try to limit these corruption. We can never wipe it out. It will probably take 10, 20 years if we're really serious. But the human rights violations, yes, we should be more vocal, and we should embarrass those who, in the name of revolutionary legitimacy, they are torturing people under their arrest. Of course, we should be more vocal. I mean, I speak as somebody who was kidnapped in Tripoli and was going to be liquidated and killed, and thank God I got away. So I know exactly what the fear and when you get taken by these militias. But the other point I would like to allude to, which is very serious as well, is this issue of security and freedom. you know, this paradox in the whole world, people talk about in the literature as well, security and freedom. Sometimes they say you have freedom for security. I think that's very, very dangerous, because people like Haftar will actually prey on people's vulnerabilities and say, I'm going to make you secure, but you have to give up your freedoms for that. To me, that there is another name for that. It's called dictatorship. So we have to be very careful about that as well. It's like the paradox of the two Ds, democracy and development. And I've researched this thoroughly in my PhD. Which one do we start with first? Do we democratize first, or do we achieve development first? There are two schools, and both of them have strong arguments. People say to you, Singapore and South Korea and China now have developed first, economically developed first, and then it was democratize. Other people say no, you have democracy first, then you will have the right conditions and environment to achieve real development. So it is a catch 22. These are deep issues. Unfortunately, even at the intellectual level, we don't have leaders and politicians who can actually articulate them and explain them and try to give a vision based on these paradoxes. It's not easy, but I think we should try hard.
Okay. Peter, almost everyone here has mentioned General Khalifa Haftar in some respect, a major player now. Do you think there is any role for him? Should the UN recognize him in talks, the UN mediated talks in Geneva, or is he too divisive a figure to include?
I'd like to answer the question. I'd also like to speak to the debate on transitional justice and human rights, which, may I do that first? And then
Yeah, or either or
discuss
as long as it's brief.
So, I mean, I was keen because we actually devoted a chapter and a half of the book to looking at the development of transitional justice after the Declaration of Liberation. So just a few broad remarks. A very broad observation is that a really proper an amnesty and rehabilitation campaign takes a generation. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa is still going on. The amount of data and records that needs to be waded through to look to have any kind of national reconciliation program is the work of a generation. It's not the work of a few politicians in 6 months or a year. And the other thing is just to, I think Juma made a fair point, which is that you need to build the institutions first, and only then can the institutions even begin that generational task. And at the moment, I mean, there have been efforts to build those institutions, but it's, you know, the UN had a transitional justice unit. There was efforts to rehabilitate and train the police and this and that. But again, it comes back to the point that these efforts were either halted or became undone because of the fact there was no political settlement in the country. And in Libya, that political conflict is, when there's a political conflict like that, it's solved by means of militia. If you need to fight your corner, or if you need to fight something, you don't enter parliament and fight your case. You form a militia, and then you fight your case. We are in a issue of militia politics. So again, it's this horrible chicken and egg situation of needing to have a political settlement first, and that's occupying most people's. In terms of bandwidth, that's what is occupying people's attention, rightly or wrongly right now. I guess that brings me to Haftar. Haftar is extremely controversial, what he is doing. I think the controversy extends on both sides of the divide right now, in terms of Operation Fajr and also Karama. He is not, for example, the chief of staff of the Libyan army. It is not Haftar, but he is increasingly acting like he is.
Although he could be soon, right?
Well, that's a political. Again, I mean, he could manoeuvre himself into that position. I think there would be resistance to that within the Karama camp if he, within the eastern faction camp. Let's not say, because Haftar is Operation Karama. His support rests on a few army divisions and a few communities and tribes in the east of Libya. It does not extend to the entirety of the Thinney government, for example. So I think you'd find him like, he did announce recently that he would confine his operations to combat ISIS and Ansar al-Sharia and particular groups that have been labelled as terrorist. He's getting into very, very difficult waters when he exceeds that mandate. I mean, it was his airstrikes on Misrata's airport that were particularly controversial. I think that has made it very difficult for him to become a Sisi, an Abdel Fattah Sisi. That and the fact that he has little national army on which to stand. He has to create his own, what is effectively a militia in the guise of an armed force.
All right. Abdurrahman, is there anything you'd like to respond to from the other panelists? Or I can throw you a curveball if you want.
Yeah, no, there's a few points actually.
Yeah.
There's a few points.
You can do it briefly and then we'll get to questions after
it. There's a lot of issues that the previous speakers brought up, and they're absolutely crucial. To understand why there is no accountability, to understand why there's corruption, human rights violations, why they're failing, you have to go right down to the core question. And the core question for me is what incentivizes that behavior? To understand that is to understand the nature of the state. And afterwards, after the revolution and during the revolution, what ended up happening was not the destruction of the state, but the fragmentation of the very factors that make a state. So to have a state, if we can agree that you need international recognition, monopoly on the use of force, and control over the territory, what the government, ever since the time of the NTC, all the way up until the Thinney government, the Libya Dawn events had, was international recognition. They didn't have monopoly on the use of force, and they didn't have direct control over the territory. And this is where the militias came in, because the militias are the groups from the local areas who did have monopoly on the use of force. So unfortunately, it's not a question of whether you pay salaries or not. It's a question of how much do you pay, because the state really is being blackmailed, not just by the armed groups, but the entire population, because it employs 80% of the workforce. To not pay salaries is to cause another uprising. This is the reality. And this is why there's 60% of the budget going to salaries and subsidies to the citizens. So after Libya Dawn, what you had really was even the destruction of the three factors that make a state. So international recognition, and they don't have monopoly use of force, and they don't have control. So there's one government that has international recognition, and in the best case scenario, if there's a unity government, they would still only have one factor. They don't have direct control over the people who have monopoly on the use of force. And that is not going to happen until there's a mass reform. And there's not going to be accountability or the destruction of corruption or the addressing of human rights violations. So there is a mass reform of the state, and this is what the revolution is all about. It's not about replacing Gaddafi with more ministers and more people in charge of the existing system that Gaddafi built. It's about changing the whole system. Nobody has put forward a vision to the change of that system. Everybody's talking about who's in charge of the old system. And unfortunately, this isn't going to work. Now, the issue of capacity building and building of the state, in my role as a security advisor, one of the tasks was following up the results of the London and Paris meetings, where maybe over two or three dozen countries offered tangible capacity building and security sector reform and DDR programs to the Libyan government. The issue isn't the international community. They were banging down our doors. They have 2 or 3 or 4 embedded advisors in nearly every ministry. The embedded foreign advisors in the ministries, including the Prime Minister's office, are in conflict with each other. That's how many of them there are. It's not an issue of the international community. It's the issue of the Libyan government not being able to absorb that capacity. And it's not a matter of skill. I've seen extremely skilled people working in some of these ministries. The issue is that the state itself incentivizes counterproductivity. It rewards corruption. It rewards not turning up. And it punishes productivity and efforts to reform. So if you use, there's a book that I can recommend by Carol Quigley called The Evolution of Civilizations. And if you read that book, we have the very definition of the institutions that are at their maturity stage right before the collapse of a civilization, which means that the institution exists for reasons other than what is written on the label. They don't exist to perform a function. They are not an organization of individuals to perform function. They exist to pay salaries and to provide political control for the people in charge. And I'm not surprised that we have mass conflict all over the country now, because for the last 3 years, I've sat with extremely rational, intelligent Libyans of all levels, in cafes, in ministries, in the government. And on all the sides, because I wouldn't say there's both sides of a political spectrum, all of the different sides of the political spectrum effectively believed that the exclusion of who they believed to be opponents would be the solution to Libya's problems. People on one side of the political spectrum, even revolutionaries, rational human beings, said the only solution with Islamists is to wipe them out. There is no other solution with extremists except to put them in prison, torture them, and assassinate them. The other side of the political spectrum was saying, well, for example, the Islamists were saying, hardliners and moderates, we support the creation of parallel institutions. We do not support the reform of the old institutions. We do not believe that the leadership of the previous apparatus and the previous regime or the previous tribes should be involved in the creation of the new Libya. It's all exclusionary politics. Everybody was talking about exclusionary politics, and everybody was saying the only solution with Libya, Libyans don't have shame, they fear. So therefore you have to use a stick. Libya won't solve, I'm sure Juma has heard the same thing, the problems won't be solved until we have dam l'irkab, until we have blood all the way to the ankles. So this is what unfortunately people have been saying for the last 3 or 4 years, and now they are implementing. All in all, I think the current conflict, I wouldn't describe any of the factions engaging in total war. I think they're all engaged in ceremonial warfare. I don't think in reality, when it comes to actually fighting, any of the organizations want to actually eliminate a tribe, eliminate and kill all of their opponents. They just want to subjugate them. And with what that leads to is this issue of justice for stability, whereby people believe that we need to have, in effect, a boot over our necks in return for. So, I mean, for me, the National Unity Government, the talks in Geneva, they don't represent the actual actors warring with each other for a start. Politicians, I have no doubt in my mind that politicians from all the different factions could sit anywhere in a hotel abroad or inside Libya and get on extremely well and come to the conclusion that a national unity government would benefit everybody. Why? Because everybody's going to end up with ministerial and deputy ministerial positions. Everybody's going to end up with ambassadorial roles abroad, working in embassies. And even the leaders of the armed faction, if they do get involved, the solution of how to silence an armed faction would be get the head of the brigade and put him in a senior position in the Ministry of Defense. This is a disaster. This is a repetition of what's been happening for the last 4 years. We're going to run out of money, and we're more than likely going to be invaded very soon. And we're going to create the types of threat that we seek to destroy. You know, the seeds only exist.
We hold that thought about being invaded very soon, because I'm sure that's going to crop up in the questions. We haven't talked about Islamic State yet, which has obviously dominated the headlines in the past week. I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So if you could take 3 questions, and if you just wait for the microphone to get to you because it's being live streamed. Yeah, front.
Ahmed Al-Shibani.
And can you tell us who the question is directed to in the panel?
Ahmed Al-Shibani, founder of the Democratic Party in Libya. My question is addressed to Ms. Mary Fitzgerald. 4 years ago, the whole world came to prevent Benghazi being attacked. Today, Benghazi is being destroyed by Gaddafi's army, what's left of it, fortified by the old Arab regime, namely in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. Do you think, that's my prediction, that Sisi will invade Libya approximately 9 months from now? Do you think that will pose as an existential threat to the state of Israel?
Okay. Can we get a couple more questions, then we can start answering? Yep, gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant, former UK government intelligence analyst. My question is for all the panel, and it does somewhat follow on from the previous gentleman's point.
Can you address it to just one, please?
Oh,
We're going to run out of time very quickly.
Yourself. Thank you. I was at Sir John Sawyer's speech, which was widely reported in the press from Monday night, where he seemed to suggest there's a case for a limited UN-sanctioned international intervention. And I'd just like to wonder, is there a danger that by intervening to go after Islamic State, in fact, it's an intervention that does not address the wider issues of Libya? I worked in Ukraine, and I was approached to join a mission based almost entirely on an EC mission in Ukraine for Libya. It actually even had the same title, the EU Border Assistance Mission.
We were the focal points for that mission.
Yeah, and I noticed that I would seriously question, at least in its inception, whether Brussels took much attention of your views, because it seemed to be just a transplant of the very different circumstances of Ukraine.
All right, thank you. And the gentleman at the back there.
أبو بكر الشماحي من journalist العربي الجديد. I have a question for, let me think, Dr. Jamal Qamati. The crux of the situation now, or how it's being described a lot of the time in the international media, is being boiled down to this divide between Islamists and secular groups. And I'm pretty sure that that's a gross simplification of what's going on in Libya. So I'd like you just to kind of give us a breakdown of who exactly the two sides are. Is this regional? Is it religious? Is it something else?
Right. Shall we begin answering? Mary? Will Egypt invade Libya within 9 months?
Well, I think it's impossible to predict with any certainty what might happen in Libya over the next 6 months. We've seen such an extraordinary twist and turn in Libya over the last year. It's very difficult to predict with any certainty. But just specifically on following on from Abdurrahman's remarks, and a number of people have raised the question of Islamic State and that. And this relates to, as well, the situation in Benghazi, and also relates to Haftar. Of course, Islamic State has been grabbing all the headlines, and as a journalist covering Libya, it's a battle all the time to try and get attention for the Libya story. Libya has, to compare it with all the fuss about Libya in 2011, and to see where Libya is now in terms of news priorities. But the Islamic State issue has pushed it back up again. And a couple of things on the Islamic State presence in Libya. Over the last 8 months, as this political power struggle has deepened, we've seen how one side in this political power struggle has used the Islamic State issue as a political tool. So, for example, in last September, when I was in Tripoli, I was doing some reporting on fighting that was happening in the Warshafana area on the outskirts of Tripoli at that time. A doctor in the hospital in Warshafana, who was very pro the anti-Libya Dawn side, was calling me every day claiming that they were being attacked by Daesh, Islamic State. So that was very much part of the kind of narrative in the political power struggle. And there were elements within the Karama, or the side aligned with the internationally recognized government, who were claiming to see Islamic State around every corner in Libya, claiming to do so in many cases for political purposes. So they were accusing their political rivals as being in cahoots with Islamic State. This in turn fed a tendency in the Dawn camp, that is the broad camp of alliances connected with the self-declared government in Tripoli, to either completely deny that there was any Islamic State in Libya, or downplay the threat. So the power struggle complicated the issue of Islamic State in Libya, and continues to do so. We've seen last week Islamic magazine declared Omar al-Hassi, the head of that self-declared government in Tripoli, his officials and security forces, as apostates. We've seen forces aligned with that Dawn Alliance going to Sirte over the last week to confront groups there that they refuse to call Islamic State, but have declared themselves to be Islamic State sympathizers. So I think when it comes to the internationals and how internationals see the current crisis in Libya and the specter of expanding Islamic State presence in Libya, they basically push the idea that Libyans, the mainstream of Libyans, have to overcome these differences right now, have to realize that actually more unites them than divides them, and they're all facing this threat of Islamic State.
Right.
Can I just say one thing on the gentleman who asked the question about the different camps and the narratives? And as a journalist covering Libya, I find the battle of narrative in Libya to be fascinating. Key players on both sides of the current political power struggle have admitted to me that the battle for narrative is a key part of the battle. They see this as a propaganda war, both sides. So we've seen how both sides have their own narratives that they peddle to push their particular cause. One side claims to be fighting what they claim is an attempt at an Islamist takeover of Libya. The other side claims that it's fighting essentially a counter-revolution led by elements linked with the former regime. You can say that there's a kernel of truth in both narratives, in that the Libya Dawn faction allied with the Tripoli authorities, there are Islamic within that camp. Similarly, in the rival camp, you do have elements linked to the former regime. But this battle for narrative is creating a fog of propaganda, not just in terms of the outside world's understanding of what's happening in Libya, but Libyans' understanding of what their own country.
What was that? I'll answer the questions. There was one regarding intervention. All countries have their national interests, and they have ambitions of expansion of their interests economically and politically. This is completely natural. We're surrounded by countries that have economic and national security interests that they need to protect. And the reality is that all of our neighboring countries would seek to exploit the areas around where their countries border. This doesn't just include Egypt. Egypt has always had a historical, economic and social link with Libya. Istawlad Ali exists on the border of Libya and Egypt, which is extremely influential in the west of Egypt and the east of Libya, partly because they were expelled from the Green Mountains by what the residents of the east of Libya who happen to come from the west. So this is a very complicated story, but you have to look at the historical elements to understand what's happening now. So in that sense, we've seen Egypt, Niger, Chad, Algeria always try to intervene in some way, shape or form for the last 3 or 4 years. And Egypt has been the most active. And now they're finding an excuse. Will they use ground forces? Will they limit it to airstrikes? Will they function as part of a UN mandated force? This is a different question, because they've already broken the UN sanctions treaty by attacking without the approval of the UN Security Committee, as well as the support of the government with arms and ammunition, the same way that Qatar and Turkey has to the other side. And this is the game that everybody's playing. I don't think that the type of intervention that's being discussed now is going to be the type of intervention that is going to address the issues that the international community would like to address. Neither will it solve any of Libya's problems in any way, shape or form, because the type of intervention that they're likely to create is the type of intervention that will actually encourage the retrenchment of ISIS and of their allies in Libya, rather than combating the idea or addressing them for what they are in reality, which is a loosely organized group of small cells and individuals who conduct operations extremely effectively, rather than an organized militia which will be able to take control over large areas and large swaths of territory and govern them and everything else. That could be created with the wrong type of intervention. There are different ways, different methods of intervention which could provide a platform for the protection of critical infrastructure, the protection of oil infrastructure, the protection of government facilities, and the protection of basic services to the citizen. And this has largely been rejected for the past 4 years by this proud nationalistic element that we do not want any foreign influence, no foreign intervention whatsoever. And this is something that can make you extremely popular with most Libyans, because if you come out and say that you want international intervention in Libya, you will be extremely unpopular, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. That discussion is a very difficult discussion to have. So the EU Border Assistance Mission was part of the Paris meeting recommendations, and I was the deputy head of the Supreme Committee on Border Affairs, or the Border Management Working Group of the Libyan government, which is the focal point for the EU Border Mission. And the point of those efforts was really to coordinate activities of the Libyan government on national security issues and coordinate the international community's activities on security issues, because everybody was fighting each other over contracts and agreements, and the bilateral was taking over the multilateral. There was a lot of complaints about that mission from our bilateral partners and from Brussels and everything else. And I would say there was a significant amount of effort and resources put into it. But as with all international cooperation programs on security, civil society, etc., they weren't based on a correct needs analysis and analysis of the reality. It was based on what the international community's institutions saw as a matter of procedure and historical experience in other countries. So basically, even if there was an alternative way of managing those type of cooperation and military intervention, they wouldn't do it. Why? Because their institutions are not built to coordinate with non-state focal points, to coordinate with these type of environments. And the harsh reality is that the level of success for these types of mission in other countries for the last 50 years, including military intervention against not just Islamic extremist organizations, but for all kind of liberation movements or whatever else, has failed in most places and has created the regional climate, the destructive element where the whole entire Middle East is on fire, basically. This is what's been created by the international community's actions over the last 50 years.
Can I stop you there, Abdurrahman, because we've got some more questions to finish off. Very briefly, Mr. Jomar,
Sure.
who are the sides here? What is the narrative? What's the best, most succinct way of
I think we cannot give an overview of Libya and what's going on without talking about the ideological divide and this conflict, supposedly conflict between Islamists and the other camp, which is, say, liberal stroke secularists. Let me begin by saying that Libyans have known for 42 years, have known power in one person, and that is Gaddafi. The concept of power is Gaddafi. After Gaddafi is gone, we found it very difficult to grapple with this concept of power. Normally in a democracy, power, and I mean political power, you get elected, you get a mandate to manage power for a certain period, 4 or 5 years, and then either the mandate is renewed or you lose the elections, you exit gracefully, you congratulate the other side, and the other side takes over power, managing power. In Libya, over the last 2 years, after the elections of 7th of July 2012, the GNC, the political parties who took part, mainly the Islamists and the nationalist stroke secular, showed a totally different understanding of power, and that is not to manage power, but to grab power, use it to accumulate wealth, and make sure you eliminate the other side totally. You gain at the expense of the eliminating the other side. A typical zero-sum game, as Abdurrahman said. Typical culture of zero-sum game. This is the understanding of power. In the Zidane government, from 2012 until last year, about 18 months, 20 months, he gave about 6 ministries to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Justice and Development Party, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood, and he gave about 8 or 9 ministries to the other camp, which is the National Alliance headed by Mahmoud Jibril. He gave them about 9 ministries. Both parties, as you used those ministries and the huge budgets under them to honestly to just skim it and try to accumulate wealth for their parties. This is how the factions are playing with power and using or misusing power. Now, the unfortunate thing is, the irony is that Libyan population, 99% of Libyans are non-ideological. I believe in the whole world now, even in the West, we are not just in the post-modernity era, we are in the post-ideology era. Probably you've seen it in this country. Libyans are non-ideological, and yet this 1% or less than of Islamists' ideology versus secular or liberal ideology are actually fighting over power and wealth in Libya, and the 99% are suffering. We told them, we advised them, political parties, please step back, wait until we set the rules of the game, until we have a permanent constitution. I'm involved in a political party. We're the only one who did back and said clearly we will not enter any elections, we will not compete any elections until we have a permanent constitution and a permanent status. But the others
you didn't compete in elections?
Never. Tagir party never competed even in local elections. Never whatsoever. No. Never. We never put up one candidate in either national or local elections. So yet this is really the irony. The Islamists wants to take out the liberals want to take out the Islamists. Typical zero-sum game. Because they totally either misunderstood or deliberately misusing this concept of political power in a democracy versus power how it was under the hegemony of one man, Gaddafi.
Right, thank you. Can we get 3 more questions, please? At the back, there's a lady there.
There's a reason that Daesh seem to be active and operative across Iraq, Syria, and Libya. These seem to be weak states. I, for one, am really frustrated at the prevalence of all these binaries. So Libyans are either weak or shameful, needing of help, or too violent. There needs to be an engagement with civil society, and I've heard civil society being mentioned once. So that also does relate to the problem of militias. We also seem to misremember Iraq. If the world is going to learn any lessons from history, then it needs to realize that the problem of militias relates to civil society, and the fact that it's completely atomized. So is the solution somewhere in between the level of government and the level of civil society? Because we haven't discussed this, and there seems to be a complete sort of like disregard of the power that Libyans themselves have. Why is the solution either held in the hands of the UN or in the hands of these diasporic Libyans? This needs to be addressed.
Okay, who would you want to direct your question to?
I'd like Abdurrahman to answer it, or anybody else. It's open.
Can I please
it's
take
an
it?
open one.
We'll let Ham get this one. Yep.
Thank you. Abdurrahman, do you
See
mind?
you itching.
Yes.
A lady at the back there in the corner, the red scarf.
To the same person, actually. I'm just wondering, I'm particularly interested in what you said about the importance of human rights and accountability. There not being a possibility for peace without justice, but justice means a huge number of different things to different people. And previous conflicts and coming out of them have dealt us very different lessons. And so I'm wondering, is there an appetite for an accountability style, individual responsibility mechanism, or one that would focus more on truth and reconciliation, in which case an amnesty would be given in compensation for the truth, and which do you think would be preferable in Libya's specific context?
Right, does anyone have a question for Peter?
Yeah.
Yep. At the back.
Mohammed Abdul Magid from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Question on technicalities. Any idea how does each government fund itself? Has the central bank approved a separate budget for each, and how do they have access to oil wealth?
Okay, excellent question. So, Alham,
Thank
accountability,
you.
amnesty, access.
Yes, civil society.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I definitely share your frustration. I'm sure you could hear it. Sorry, so much so that I got my pen in my hair. I think for me that's exactly the issue. At the moment, it's very easy for everyone to have a clear narrative. It's very easy to have a clear narrative if you have two sides. And it's much easier if when you're telling your narrative there's a good guy and a bad guy, and that's what everyone does. Except that there is really no good guy in those narratives. But I think what we need to look at is, if you look at the level where really there is change, because of this vacuum that everyone's talking about, because the state can't do and is unable and is incompetent and all the excuses we keep hearing, a lot of those vacuums are actually filled by civil society. And I think the issue with Libya is that civil society is not protected. There is absolutely zero laws in Libya that protect you as a civil society or indeed even allow you to do your work. We're still operating technically under Gaddafi-era laws when it comes to civil society. The mechanisms are there to shut you down, actually, if you want. And not only that, we've even seen in the new recommendations from the CDA, which is meant to be this savior of Libya, that civil society in the new, if people look at it in the right section of the drafts that have been submitted, is really curtailed. For you to be a civil society organization under the new Libya, you have to be registered by the state, and they haven't said what the criteria are for registration. So that's your Egyptian model of preventing you to do anything. And the second one is there's absolutely zero funding allowed from international sources. So basically those two things kill civil society in Libya, because I'm yet to see Libyan state funding civil society. What's happened there is we've taken the Egyptian model and if you like, promoted it to the constitutional level instead of just leaving it at legislation level. So what we're doing is killing civil society metaphorically, legally, but physically, actually. There have been over 500 targeted assassinations of civil society people in the last year in Libya. This is a serious thing. I don't know any activists who've done work who hadn't have to leave the country or go in hiding or are missing. So I think there is a real problem here, and I go back to the same point, and it brings me to your point about human rights and accountability. Human rights is not a luxury. It's a must. If our civil society is to function, if our government is to be held to account, if we're to minimize corruption, you must have legal systems. Our laws aren't in place to protect the citizens. They're being put in place to protect the governments. And I think to keep in mind, look at even the draft of this current constitution. There's rights in there, but the curtailment is all over it. And you get laws like the political isolation law, like the anti-glorification law, like the Law 5 that prohibits criticism, all intended to put a gagging order on civil society. And forget all that, then there's justice on the ground, which doesn't even need to rely on the laws, incidentally. They can just go and get you and deal with you, and there's zero accountability for that. So it's this really horrible situation where the people who are doing the work are the only people who aren't protected. And I think that's, organizations like the one I work for and many really great organizations on the ground in Libya are suffering from. And if this constitution goes through in the current form that's being proposed, it's game over for civil society. And let's just keep that in mind. Human rights and accountability. True, justice means different things to different people. In a survey we did, we asked people really basic questions about what things like torture mean. 67% of the people we interviewed, and we interviewed over 3,000 people, defined torture by who committed it. So there's a lot of ground there. Also in our survey, whenever we take a witness statement from someone or a victim, one of the questions we always ask them is whether they want reparations or whether they want accountability, just to help us know what kind of cases to bring. We are yet to have a single person out of the hundreds and hundreds of statements that we've taken where someone has asked for anything other than accountability. And I think that's something that is lost on the power makers. They seem to think the way you buy militias, you can buy everything in Libya. And there are certain people who don't want that. And if you look at the transitional justice mechanisms that have been put in, they're all about reparations. Very little is actually about accountability. And that's the frustration. It's this idea that let's just wrap this up and move on. But actually, you can never wrap it up unless there are people who taking responsibility for what they've done. Truth, reconciliation, committees, I think, we always give this example when we talk about South Africa. South Africa was a negotiated transition. It's different. And also, incidentally, even the amnesties in South Africa were not unconditional. And not everyone got an amnesty. There are certain things for which amnesty don't apply, and most of the crimes in Libya legally are not eligible for amnesty anyway. You can't give amnesty for torture, you can't give amnesty for war crimes. So for what the kinds of if you like, crimes we're looking at in Libya, they're not eligible for amnesty anyway, even if that's the route we have to go. The only route there is accountability, and the victims don't want that. They don't want to be bought out. They've lived through that for 40 odd years, actually, and now they want to have their moment.
Right, thank you, Anham. Peter, oil revenues are down to a trickle,
Right.
and yet everyone's still continuing to be paid.
Your question was very technical. Could you? I have to ask you to repeat it because you're asking about does the central bank
Is being funded.
how each government operates.
How each government operates financially, how do they have access to oil wealth? For example, is the government in Tripoli, since it's not internationally recognized, does it sell oil through the NOC? How does it?
I don't. Yeah, can you help me out?
Yeah, we could have.
Even the central bank has very conflicting statements on who it's funding. They said, or I think Abdurrahman mentioned that 60% of the budget is dedicated to subsidies and wages. But subsidies and wages to whom? To the east or the west or both?
I can have a pop.
I mean, there's one observation I can make is that the ministries in Tripoli will still be on the state payroll, even though the government is the pro-Fadri government. The ministries are still, as I understand it, largely the same. Did you want to?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Is there any other?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the ministries are being funded directly, but the Finnish government mentioned as late as last month that they're running on a massive bank loan. And so there have been funding issues, and they've said that they're working on an alternative funding mechanism whereby they're going to try and sell oil directly on international markets. That's going to be very difficult to achieve. Currently, it's all being funded through the central bank, which is funneling these funds directly through ministries, whether they be in Tripoli, whether they be in Benghazi or elsewhere. And a lot of people, as several panelists mentioned, most employees in Libya are state employees, and their salaries are flowing directly into their bank accounts, in some cases because of lack of oversight. More than one salary is being paid to different people because there's no kind of oversight tracking payments. So people are getting paid. The fiscal situation is being hugely depleted. Foreign reserve exchange is being run down daily. The central bank has warned of the dire situation, but until there's a unity government, until there's a way of actually formalizing this agreement, it's going to be very difficult to.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Just add a few things to clarify this. As Peter earlier said, there are very few institutions which are still intact and actually reputable. Those two are the central bank and the NOC, the National Oil Corporation. In Libya, luckily, the only institution that sells oil and contracts with purchases of Libyan oil is the NOC. And NOC is mandated to receive payments and put them in the central bank. The central bank made a statement back in July or August and said it's not going to be part of this political struggle. It's going to be above it, and it's not going to give budgets to either of the governments, the Tripoli government or the Tobruk government. What it's going to continue to do is pay salaries for all Libyans who are in the payroll and pay the subsidies. So the central bank is continuing to pay salaries for people whether they are in the east or the west, Tobruk or Tripoli, wherever they are, and it's paying subsidies for fuel and essential food for people wherever they are, east or west. Anything else, the central bank is not paying. The Hassi government or the TNI government. The TNI government has borrowed, I think, 1.5 billion from a local bank, and the Hassi government somehow managed to get few hundred dinars from somewhere, from an old account or whatever, but they are very, very tight. They are very tight, and they don't have the billions that they would love to have, and that's why they are weak. And I think it's good that the central bank said it's not going to give budgets to both governments, because now this has proven to be a very good leverage to force both sides to come to the table and actually achieve a political resolution.
Right. Can I just make a quick on the civil society?
Yeah, because we're going to get another round of questions.
A minute. No, your point's well taken. There is actually a fair amount of funding and training of civil society going on in Libya. I mean, there's an entire track of the UN peace process that is devoted to Libyan civil society, although it hasn't quite kicked in yet. The European Commission has a lot of funding available for civil society. So do media training. There's been several ongoing programs for media training. So I just wanted to make that addition. That it is there. It's just that the broader strategic issues we've been talking about haven't been resolved yet.
Yeah. Okay. Can we get 3 very quick fire questions and quick fire answers?
Female?
Yeah. Sure. Lady at the back.
Thank you. My name is Nadine Bougaygis. Nadine Bougaygis. May I ask in Arabic or do I have to ask in English?
Whatever you feel. We can translate.
Okay, perfect. في الوقت الحالي اوكي الدولة تقوم كما تكلم السيد جمعة والسيد خلفي سأل السؤال. الآن حاليا ليبيا تقوم بتمويل الحرب والانقسام في الدولة لأنها تدفع في مرتبات للبرلمان، تدفع في مرتبات للمؤتمر الوطني، تدفع في مرتبات للجيش متاع حفتر ولجميع الميليشيات. كيف نقدروا نوقفوا هذا الإمداد وإذا احتجنا إلى الأجانب باش يوقفوا الإمداد هذاهي هل معناها يبوا يحطونا على الوصاية؟ لأن هذا موضوع يقلق كثير من الليبيين، خايفين من الفساد اللي مازال يصير في العراق. فكيف ممكن نقدر نحلوا المشكلة هذه؟ لأن أعتقد أن دولتنا إحنا ليبيا هي الأساس في funding. Basically the country is funding the war in Libya. They're paying for the militias, for the parliament, for المؤتمر الوطني.
Sure. Yeah.
GNC.
Yeah. So basically they're paying the militias. So they're basically funding the war and the division in the country.
Okay.
My question is for Sada Ilham Saudi.
Okay.
Are we doing any more?
Yeah, well, let's get 2 more very quick questions and hopefully quick answers because we're just overrunning on time. Gentleman at the back.
Hi. By all accounts, the previous 4 governments were all national unity governments, and they all systematically failed, whilst the militias still remained. So how does Mr. Jim how does he perceive and how does he see the role of the so-called new unity government that will be formed? How will they be any different? What can they do any different whilst militias still remain?
Yeah.
Whilst I'm on that point, just a quick question as well to you again, sir.
Sorry, just one question.
Yeah, sorry.
So
It's just based on the militias, the transgressions that the militias have basically done over the past 4 years. As a previous dissident of the Gaddafi regime and an advocate for human rights, you, as well as other prominent politicians, haven't spoken to the international community, have never ever mentioned any of the transgressions that are made by the militias, and if essentially your narrative is different to the international audience and to the internal audience, to the internal Libyan audience. Why is that? Thank you.
Okay, and final question, please. Gentleman at the back there.
Hi, my name is Fadel Ali-Riza. I'm a freelance journalist. Just a question about some of the actors who are involved in Libya, Egypt, the Gulf countries, Turkey. Do any of you have a take on whether any of these players have an end game strategy, and if so, whether they can actually affect what's going on the ground, or whether the sort of chaos and disjointed nature of the militias would prevent any sort of them affecting their strategy and end game strategy, whatever that may be.
Are you talking about the militias themselves?
No, I'm talking militias or these 2 camps or whatever the intervention. I mean, I understand we have very limited information about all of the details of what Egypt or Gulf countries or Turkey.
Can you narrow it down to one group, because it's going to be difficult to answer what the goals of each. There's lots of different groups. It's going to be, if you could narrow it down to one particular actor that you'd want to find out what the goal is, it'd be an easier question to answer.
We can break it down to the 2 major groups.
Okay.
And
okay. Yeah. Would you like to take the last question then?
Okay, sure. It's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. But yeah, so let's try this. think if there is an end game, it's more to do with these countries' internal political situation rather than any end game for Libya. I don't think a regional vision of what Libya should be. Whether it's the Emirates or whether it's Turkey or whether it's Egypt, these countries have internal disputes between Islamic currents and secularist currents that kind of spill over into their security establishments and their foreign policy establishments. And that affects usually the handling of the relationships with Libyan counterparts can be run through, intelligence, special forces, the diplomatic community, and it's not always unified. And that goes for Syria and other countries as well. In certain countries, there are certain establishments run different policies that are counterintuitive to other establishments. So, I guess the short, brief answer is no, alas. But there's a logic. Right? There's no vision, but there's a logic.
Mr. Joma, how will the new government be any different from previous unity governments?
Well, he had two questions. Let me deal with very quickly. The narrative when we are abroad or speaking to international community, the narrative is different. We are from the local narrative where we are not criticizing militias. Personally, let me remind you, in October 2012, I went on a local television called Al Asima. I criticized all the militias and named them by name. Within a week, I was kidnapped by one of them called the Kaka, and they wanted to silence me forever. I was very lucky. I think my family and children were very lucky that they saw me again. Of course, you have to be tactful and you have to be careful. You don't expect me to stand in Martyr Square in Tripoli right now and shout that, for example, the militias of, I'm not going to pick another city, let's say my own city, the militias of Garian are all thugs and murderers. What will happen to me? In a few hours, I will just disappear forever. It highlights what Ilham has been talking about. The violations of human rights is huge, is absolutely phenomenal now. But is this expected? In a transition. Why is it? We can talk about that maybe in another day where Ilham is the key speaker and we can go on for hours. But that is my answer to you.
Done.
Exactly.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, but in my age, I'm not 20 years old, where I was crazy and suicidal. I have to think a little bit more now with a large family. Come to the real question. How as a new government be different? You're absolutely right. If we carry on like before, if we don't curtail those militias and have an absolute mechanism in place where they will not intervene with the government and hamper its role and impede its role, then it's never going to work. I think Bernardino Leon has a holistic program, has a comprehensive plan that works. It will accommodate this concern. They also plan to gather all the key militia leaders in one big dialogue and get a commitment from them that they will not intervene, they will not impede the work of a new national unity government, that it should have full empowerment and it should be free to make decisions, and it should be able to go about seriously for the first time ever in about rebuilding the army, rebuilding the security, so that we can replace those militias with a proper army and police and security operators which are accountable to the state. At the moment, we have people who are in charge of security in Libya who are accountable to no one. They are civilians, and that is the problem. This is unheard of, but that is the reality. The shift is not easy. Everything in Libya we need to do is not easy because it amounts to a paradigm shift. The shift to how manage power, the shift how to achieve security, the shift to how have accountability, the shift to how respect human rights and counter corruption. All these things are huge, concepts that are not easily implemented on the ground. It's going to require patience, but most importantly, it requires consensus from the key political players, the tribal chiefs, all the regional players. The regional powers must have consensus about a new order in Libya, about a new transition period, maybe for 2 years or so, that hopefully will stick and will work better than the last 4 years.
We can wish for consensus.
Yes, absolutely.
Adham, final
answer?
Yeah,
I think it was a really eloquently put question because what we heard earlier was that the central bank is neutral and what it was doing was good because it was staying out of the conflict. But my reading is actually yours, that it's not really staying out of the conflict. Sometimes neutrality isn't objectivity. The question was, sorry, I'll repeat the question, correct me if I misrepresent it. But the question was, saying that the central bank is funding all parties and is doing that, because it's neutral is problematic, because what it's actually doing is funding the war, because it's paying both sides to continue fighting each other. So it's funding the GNC, funding the parliament, funding the militias, and funding the army, or quasi-army, whatever you want to call it. And that's my reading. I think there is a difference between being neutral and actually being almost passive-aggressive in a way, because you're suggesting that you're not getting involved, whereas you're maintaining the fight. And I think that comes back to my broken record point of accountability. Even the central bank should be accountable for the way they spend. Just because they're doing it in an equal way, it doesn't mean it's doing it in a correct way or a just way. And indeed, beyond that, if there's any kind of vetting process, we're not suggesting that the central bank should be vetting employees. But if the systems below that, the ministries they're paying, all these other actors they're paying, had some sort of vetting system for the people that they were employing, then there would be some kind of control. But I totally agree with you. I think we're in a situation where actually this institution that seems to be regarded by many as untouchable because it's being neutral is one of the key problems in Libya, because it's subsidizing the war. And I think that's a really big problem. And can I just pick up on one tiny point? And I'm glad that Ustad Juma mentioned it, because I think when you saw the human rights from your perspective, and when your rights became far more impassioned. And maybe the reason I'm so impassioned is because I deal with victims all the time. So that's the side of the story I hear, and that's why if I'm going to conclude with one thing, is it brings me back to perhaps when people seeing through their personal view, they can appreciate why it's important not to be compromising on this. Bernardino Leon has done a lot of things right, but what I've told him and his team several times is that no one should be in Geneva or Ghadames or anywhere on this earth without not only having conditionality on what they do going forward, but taking responsibility for what they did in the past. There is no amnesty, or there should be no amnesty on this table if we're genuinely going to resolve Libya's problems.
Sorry, can I comment on the civil society question very quickly, please?
If you can both, I'm going to give everyone 1 minute to sum up, because we've already overrun, but literally 1 minute.
Okay. I was also a co-founder of a civil society organization, and we came across these struggles of funding and the same struggles that the private sector come up to, which is basically that the state is an obstacle and the creator of obstacles for civil society. So I was part of this draft committee drafting the laws that govern civil society, which was for the Ministry of Civil Society. And not only did they not listen to our recommendations, but they did actually become an active obstacle, not only to funding, but also to activities, because you had to get permission to run certain activities in some cases. Unfortunately, the international community did the same thing they did with every other sector, which was an incorrect needs analysis, because they were asking impassioned Libyans through surveys, through various organizations, what they wanted. And the reality is that Libyan civil society, Libyan security sector, Libyan population didn't know what they want. So what ended up happening was the mass funding of democracy awareness, media, and women's rights. Seeing that as the main priority of which civil society was supposed to be acting, which is basically its international best practice. And it didn't work. The same way international citizens didn't work with any of the other sectors.
That's your minute up.
Yep.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any very, very quick concluding remarks?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think the issue about the central bank funding both sides and fueling the war, if the alternative is for the central bank to totally shut the tab and not pay a penny, that is also very dangerous. You have to remember, Libya is a typical rentier state where the state is the only source of income. 1.3 million Libyans draw salaries from the state. There are 900,000 registered families. The salary in Libya is a right. It's not something that you have to work for. That's the culture there. If we stop paying salaries, there will be poverty. The crime will probably, which is bad already, will probably increase by 1,000-fold. So that is a very dangerous course to. It's better to make sure that the central bank does not pay any extra budgets, but I think the essentials of salaries, whether you're a Karam, even Haftar's salary should be paid. I mean, I'm not, we have to be equal with, or the subsidies of the fuel. I think that is a must. The central bank cannot even entertain the idea of shutting the tap totally.
Right, cheap gas. Love cheap gas. Any conclusions? Very quick ones? Or should we wrap
Just to
up?
encourage everybody to pick up a copy of our book.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And we never talked about IS as well. I mean, it's strange.
I'm sure we will.
We did. No, just to make a few final points. I think the question many Libyans are asking, many ordinary Libyans are asking, is when their politicians will stop playing Nero while Rome burns. And now with the prospect of further Islamic State expansion in Libya, I think that there's really opening up this prospect of a possible three-way war where this political power struggle continues with the eruptions of fighting in different parts of the country. And Islamic State and its sympathizers in Libya take advantage of that. Islamic State and its propaganda has made no secret of the fact that it sees Libya as an ideal opportunity, a country with porous borders, vast ungoverned spaces, and this political power struggle on created a political insecurity vacuum. So I would hope that the events of the last week would focus minds both in Tripoli and Tobruk, and basically encourage people to get together at the negotiating table.
Yep.
And I think Morocco is the next venue I have.
For talks?
Yeah.
Okay, we meet in Morocco then.
Just been handed a message asking me to announce that the book is on sale tonight, another book plug, for £20 tonight compared to the usual price of £30.
Wow.
Right. On that note, can we all thank the speakers for their